our first speaker. Siri Hustvedt doesn't need a presentation. Everybody knows her. She's a famous artist, novel writer, essayist, and in a word, I had the privilege to be acquainted with her since many years. One of the most stimulating person I ever met. So I'm very happy to give you the stage. The title of her talk is Empathy, Atmosphere, and the Riddle of the Between. So please, Siri.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. In the summer of 1968, the summer after I turned 13, the same summer I made a vow to myself to become a writer, I spent many days lying on a sofa in a room in Reykjavik, Iceland, reading one novel after another. I vividly remember another room, the Red Room in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. The orphan Jane is taken in by her mother's brother, but after his death, she is disparaged as an unwanted, penniless inferior in the household. She is slugged by her cousin John, defends herself, is blamed for his violence, and punished by being locked alone in an unused, voluptuously furnished room in hues of red, pink, and white, where her uncle died 9 years earlier. I experienced the text as a near hallucination. My intense participatory feelings of fury at the injustice of it all were followed by fear of the fairy image Jane sees in the mirror and of the possible uncle ghost penetrating the locked room. The pleasure I also felt while reading, however, would never have occurred had I witnessed the mistreatment of a real child. I was saved by the aesthetic frame, inside of which I knew the story had already been written, and I had no agency to change it. Although the memory of my first trip into the Red Room has never left me, I confess the chapter does not affect me nearly as strongly now as it did then. The relation between me and the novel has changed. The text is fixed. What has changed is relational and contextual. Although the word Einfühlung, which became empathy in English, has its historical origins in aesthetics, feeling one's way into a work of art, our emotional connection with narrative is rooted in living human relations that predate the acquisition of language and literacy and turn on self-other subject-object distinctions, their interactions, and how we understand them. In the Anglo-American analytical tradition, philosophical and scientific debates about other minds have produced explanations for how a person ascribes mental life to another. The individual subject is regarded as a container sealed off from mysterious others to whom she, he, or they has no access except through the mental gymnastics of mind reading, by which a person puzzles out alien mental states by conscious analogy. This isolationist view of the human being has roots in the Greek idea of psyche or soul and was reinvigorated by Descartes in the 17th century, whose substance dualism has had an extraordinary hold in some quarters of science and philosophy of mind. This legacy has given us the paradox of fiction and quasi-emotions. The notion that a reader's feelings for a character are quasi or unreal is possible only if they are regarded as features of a disembodied psychic reality incidentally attached to some material. The corporeal fact of feeling is denied. I dare say unknown numbers of orgasms have been produced by fictional characters. Are they quasi-orgasms? Does the intense reality created between my 13-year-old self and Jane Eyre constitute a third thing? The psychoanalyst Thomas Ogden uses the third to describe what comes about in an analysis that is neither therapist nor patient, but a creation between them. The idea draws heavily on Freud's transference as, quote, the intermediate area between illness and real life, end quote, and on D.W. Winnicott's reconfiguration of the zone as a transitional developmental potential space of play and creativity, which is neither fully inside a person nor outside her in others. Ogden never mentions that 1 + 1 = 3 is a reproductive metaphor, but generation haunts his third nevertheless. The problem lies in conceptual borders we draw between one thing and another. Assumptions of substance ontology and Aristotelian essences place emphasis on being, not becoming, stasis, not change. Human beings may be described as organisms of remarkable stability over time, subject to what Maturana and Varela described as autopoiesis. And yet, the newborn and old woman on her deathbed have little in common. The bodily boundaries often assumed to be hard, fast, and determinant of a fixed identity break down rather quickly. In schizophrenia, the lack of feeling of an anchored me can create self-other confusion. I can become you. A stroke patient may attribute his paralyzed arm to his dead brother. Any number of situations can create out-of-body experiences. All of us with some tactile stimulation may claim a rubber hand on the table in front of us as our own. We are all occupied by microbial symbionts with foreign DNA, without whom we would perish. The I, it seems, is also a we. Discoveries in genomics should have ended the fantasies of genes as fixed eternal souls, because the more that is known about cellular processes in which the genome is a crucial player but not director, the more it becomes clear that spatio-temporal context and relation are crucial to cellular processes and development. Every one of us began as a zygote, a diploid cell, the product of two human beings literally mixed together, was generated inside the body of one of them, upon whom, as embryo then fetus, we were wholly dependent. After the second trimester of pregnancy, the third actor or between organ, the placenta, made from both fetal and maternal tissue and attached to both bodies, assumes multiple tasks until birth, including maternal and fetal cellular exchange, microchimerism. In late pregnancy, there is evidence of some kind of fetal relation with the mother, voice recognition, and possible rhythmic connection to her heartbeat, among others. Only after birth is separation complete, when the placenta is delivered and the cord is cut. The placenta dies and its regulatory and homeostatic functions are taken over by others. When the work of the placenta is finished, the infant is out in the world and social space opens, the between of interaction. Each one of us is pregnant with others and confirmed by them in his body, writes Merleau-Ponty, who gets closer and closer to the reality of pregnancy in his theory, especially in his idea of the flesh, in the visible and the invisible. My point is not that empathy begins in utero. Empathy relies on a clear self-other distinction. Although a form of operative or motor intentionality is probably present in the fetus, some argue as early as the second trimester, exactly when ipseity or a sense of self as separate from others begins is a matter of controversy. What I am arguing for is a dynamic understanding of empathic processes. Surely human biological merging and fertilization, the dynamic tripartite entanglement and intercorporeality of gestation are not irrelevant to what we become. The experience of pregnancy itself, which over time develops into a conscious awareness of having another being inside oneself, felt in kicks and squirms and now visible on sonograms, has been mostly excluded from the discussion of empathy. Not all pregnant women feel empathy for their fetuses, But when they do, it is largely for an imaginary fictive creature of the future, the baby. Martin Buber attributed an ontological reality to the between, das Zwischen, a dynamic space of dialogue which he argued does not belong to either interlocutor, but is created by both and is more than either. In the beginning is relation, Buber writes in I and Thou, as category of being, readiness, grasping form, mold for the soul. It is the a priori of relation, the inborn thou, end quote. The thou is not only human in Buber's world. Both a horse and a tree appear as the other of this relation. He uses pregnancy and birth as a trope for I, thou, not as a physiological reality to explore in its own right. One needn't commit to substance ontology or summon mysticism, as Buber does, to make a case for relation as fundamental to the species. To say, not I think, therefore I am, but I am because you are. The idea that the I-you axis of dialogue in language rests on a relational origin is at the very least suggestive. Every story implies a listener, or as M.M. Bakhtin put it, language, quote, lies on the borderline between oneself and the other. The word in language is half someone else's, end quote. Although quasi-emotions strike me as nonsensical, while it is being read, a book may be said to become a quasi-you. A book is an inanimate object, no more or less than the abstract symbols on its pages from beginning to end, but off the shelf and in the reader's hand, it loses its thingness. The reader knows the sentences on the page are the product of a once living or still living person whose articulations in a given language were refined and alienated from the author's body in the act of writing. A movement from inner speech, which is always already collective social speech, to its final concrete, immutable reality on page or screen. A reader's empathy, to borrow from Edith Stein, is a foreign experience. It has its origin in the book as quasi-other. Narrative empathy is my apprehension of this foreignness as an embodied feeling experience of my own, but without delusion. I was possessed by Jane's first-person narration, but I knew I could close the book if her occupation of me became too intense. On hindsight, I believe the Red Room episode served to narrate mutinous feelings, guilt, and uncertainties of my own, for which I had no words. To get out of that room, Jane had to promise, quote, perfect submission and stillness, end quote. A straitjacket for the girl or woman out of control. A year and many books later, I declared myself a feminist. Narrative is made in the between. And in that interactional space, the text can trigger recognitions in the reader that are not fully conscious, but nevertheless yank her into reflective states that would never have been possible without it. Despite the absence of a reciprocating other, this creative person-book between area is surely a form of intersubjectivity and intercorporeality afforded by neurobiological mirror systems, a pre-personal motor sensory form of attunement between human beings, but also between persons and works of art, which Vittorio Galeazzi has called, quote, the shared manifold of intersubjectivity, end quote. Another between. The developmental trajectory of these systems is unknown. What would an inborn thou mean in biological terms? Is it there in neonate imitation of adult faces? Therapists and patients have been filmed unconsciously mirroring each other. Galeze and Hanna Wachowski's liberated embodied simulation requires sitting or lying still. I move only inside the book. Absorbed reading is intense listening to a foreign voice or voices, during which the reader's inner speech or internal narrator is supplanted by the book's narrative voice or voices, a kind of possession, if you will. It is impossible for a reader to have two narrations going at once. I can withdraw from the book and think about the text. I can drift while reading, my own voice inadvertently returning, and the words become lexical signs that I take in without their meaning. But no overlap of narrations is possible without causing gibberish. Once possessed by a book, as I was by Jane Eyre, I am moved by the plight of the character and the pace of the story's unfolding, by meanings I may not fully understand, that play in me nevertheless, but I'm also moved by the rhythms of the sequential prose, fast or slow, urgent or meditative, and its music, alliteration, assonance, and consonance that create forms of empathic understanding beneath the threshold of ordinary articulation. The infant researcher Daniel Stern described the pre-narrative envelope in infant development. Stern was influenced by the American philosopher Suzanne Langer, who declared that art makes forms, quote, symbolic of human feeling, end quote. Langer's symbol was not a representation, but a kind of analog of feeling. Quote, I make feeling the starting point of a philosophy of mind. The study of feeling leads one down into biological structure and process until its estimation becomes, for the time, impossible, and upward to the purely human sphere known as culture. It is still what we feel and everything that can be felt that is important. The same concept that raises problems of science takes one just as surely into humanistic ones, end quote. Stern adapted Langer's synthesis of body and mind to the rhythms of feeling he called vitality affects in the mother-infant dyads he studied. The reciprocal sensual engagements and proto-conversations between the two, which are reenacted in ritual repetition, take on the shape of an arc with a beginning, middle, and end, during which the mutual excitement rises to a peak and then tapers to a conclusion. A proto-narrative is created in this between that prepares the ground for increasingly mature symbolic storytelling and its comprehension, for which the parent provides, to use the lingo of researchers, scaffolding. But there is another aspect which is present in both the pre-narrative envelope and the narrative of a novel, which affects infant and reader alike: atmosphere. The idea that atmospheres suffuse space is old, related to both weather and smells, but also to Stimmung, or mood. Atmosphere has recently become fashionable in several disciplinary circles. Introduced to phenomenology by Hermann Schmitz, who is hardly translated into English, in the 1960s, atmospheres include emotions. Fiercely opposed to what he called the interior world dogma, initiated, he writes, by the 5th century Greek turn to the soul that cut inner from outer life, Schmitz rejects emotions as mental phenomena and claims them as part of embodiment, Leib. They are not confined inside our skins, but pour out among us and are collectively embodied. For the infant, the known voice, degree of light, smell, feeling of the same stroking hand are probably blended in an atmospheric, amodal sensual whole. I suspect many of us have had the experience of walking into a room of people or a crowd and feeling its emotional climate, menacing or welcoming, angry, kind, or mixed, although distinguishing an emotional feature from light, sound, architecture, or human postures is no doubt tricky. Words make atmospheres too. The Gothic was an established genre by the time Jane Eyre was published. Bronte ably employed familiar literary techniques to create an atmosphere of suspense that enhances and/or destroys empathy. Every novel is steeped in the conventions, class distinctions, ideologies, and clashing perspectives of the time in which it was written. It is further altered by the time in which it is read. Contextual realities and social imaginaries that permeate the individual reader, who has their own learned prejudices, private experiences, limitations, and capacities for invention. Many critics have commented on Jane's monstrous double, Rochester's mad Creole wife, Bertha Rochester. Jane is trapped in the Red Room, Bertha in the attic. As a character, however, Bertha is all atmosphere. A demonic laugh, gurgles and moans, quote, a mystery that breaks out now in fire, now in blood, end quote. At 13, I regarded Bertha Rochester as a figure of horror, a body of rage and chaos that made perfect stillness and submission look pretty good. Bertha is clothed in the language of colonial racism. The prose blocked my empathy for her. Years later, I found Bertha again in Jean Rhys's The Wide Sargasso Sea, a book that restores her to humanity. Narrative empathy isn't simple. It leads one down into the cellular realities of human beginning and our embodied biology responsive to others, but also up into culture and its vastly diverse atmospheres we collectively create, but which also participate in creating us as social animals. The riddle of the between is not solved, but attending closely to its complexities, dynamics, and remembering what's been forgotten might help open up a few new questions. Thank you.